You're listening to Grain of Salt, a podcast hosted by Donnie Burtles and Christa covering the Buffalo Niagara region's food and drink scene. Today's episode features Christa talking about artful plating with Chef Jennifer Boye of the Mansion on Delaware and Chef Wieszala of Bourbon and Butter. The group discusses plating trends and styles, why plating matters, and how it impacts the dining experience.
Hello, I'm Christa and you're listening to Grain of Salt. Today we're going to talk about plating, and I'm here with Jennifer Boye, the executive chef at the Mansion on Delaware. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Denny. Thanks for
you?
being here.
Thanks for having me.
I'm also here with Wieszala, who is a chef at Bourbon and Butter, which is one of Mike A's restaurants in the Hotel Lafayette.
It is.
Thank you for being here, Bruce.
Thanks for having me.
So I really can't think of two people who are maybe better to talk about plating in terms of understanding, because, with no offense, because of your age, you understand classical plating and where plating has come, how far it has come over the last few years. So the idea that visual appearance of a dish is as important as flavor is not a new one. And there's this gentleman named Daniel Kahneman who did a study on hedonic psychology, and he defined the three essential components of pleasure as expectation, experience, and memory. And I think that trends play on these things predominantly, and certainly food is as subject to these trends as fashion and music and anything else is. And in today's world, with the quick and easy access granted by social media, it takes less time for plating styles and food trends to kind of make their way around the globe. And I think that these changes are usually driven by a handful of chefs. And so I think we've definitely seen a major change in plating in the last 5 years. And we're going to go over some plating vocabulary so that we're all sort of talking about the same thing using the same terminology, and so that the listener can also understand what we're referring to. But the first thing I'd like to do is kind of talk about the two dishes that we're going to feature in the image on SoundCloud that's attached to this podcast. So the one on the left is going to be a dish by Jennifer Boye, and the one on the right is going to be Bruce Wieszala's dish. And I actually asked you guys to pick your own favorite images of food to talk about. So we're going to talk about plating as a whole, but in order to kind of like set a standard so that people understand why you've been invited to have this conversation today, and also some of your thoughts behind what you're doing. So Jennifer Boye, I'm going to have you go first. So the image that we're talking about is of a dish from Nickel City Chef, I believe last year, so 2014, or is it 2013, love?
2014.
Right, where public espresso was the secret ingredient.
That's right.
And it's basically a bagel.
Yeah.
But can you talk with me a little bit about sort of what that dish is and what you were thinking in terms of how you decided to plate it?
Sure. It was a bagel that was topped with a homemade everything spice, but we also incorporated coffee grounds into it. And we filled it with acorn ham, Iberico, and we made a foie gras torchon that was soaked and cured in public coffee. And I shouldn't say this, I don't remember every other thing that was in it. I know that we did some fresh herbs to kind of counteract the earthiness, or the deep earthiness of the coffee.
And the liver, too, obviously, the foie.
Absolutely, yeah, to kind of lighten it up because it was pretty heavy. What I liked about it was the fact that our bagel dough fired on all cylinders that day. And the picture that, and I don't even know who took the picture, but whoever did caught the light just right. Yeah. And so there was a little sheen on the bagel, and you could see the spices, and you could see everything, every component as it was layered. That's all there was on this tiny little plate that we bought. It was actually a tiny little pedestal. The plates are so important when you're plating something like that. It's your canvas, really. And I just liked that picture. I thought that everything was right about that bagel on that day. The humidity in the air, the temperature of the kitchen, it just worked, which doesn't always happen.
It doesn't. And I would say that anybody trying to make bagels in the course of an hour as one of probably 9 components in that dish, which was part of probably 40 components over all 3 courses, you're kind of psychotic. But I would also like to point out that your plating style would be referred to in the industry perhaps as precious. But
Yeah,
I
we talk about that a lot.
I actually enjoy Precious, and I know that your sous chef does as well. Dan Borelli and I have talked about his plating style, which is you guys very much share some similarities in terms of really enjoying things that are small and beautiful and elegant, and yet so multi-layered with flavor and ingredients and components. What is it about that style that appeals to you? Is it your pastry background? Because a lot of it feels earthed in sort of very Frenchy modern desserts.
I think a little bit of that has to do with it, yeah. I like when you bake, you have that mentality where you want, like, it's like making a wedding cake. You want everything to be perfect.
Yes.
It never will be because you'll see all the flaws. Your customer might think that it looks impeccable, but your goal is constantly striving to make things look perfect. And if you can do that in tiny little bites like that, I think as a chef, you feel like you've succeeded. It's much easier to make in our minds, to make a tiny little thing nice and precious than to make a 30-pound wedding cake, impeccable for a bride on their most perfect day. So I think in a nutshell, it's more accessible. So I think that has something to do with that. Dan Borelli, my sous chef, my fantastic, talented sous chef, always says that he's been cursed with the cute gene when it comes to making things. When he draws, his little people are cute. And when he makes food, he wants to go for cute and precious. He thinks it's a curse. I don't. I think that when you make food like that, you have to make sure that your technique is spot on because you can pick out the mistakes. So I actually think it's kind of a good way to be disciplined.
So you see it as sort of regimented. The way cake decorating is very regimented.
Yeah.
It's very symmetrical. You have to have your math right. You have to have your balance. You have to have composition. I mean, it's an architectural engineering feat.
Right.
Actually decorating a wedding cake. And so you're applying those principles basically to very small amounts of food that may be savory or sweet.
You've got it, yeah.
Okay. Yep. Awesome. So Bruce Wieszala, king of all plating. Really, I mean, it's not just that you're fantastic at plating and that you were one of the first adopters in Western New York, in my opinion, of what is now considered sort of the modern plating, which we'll get into some of the vocabulary in a minute. But I think also you have an incredible eye, which I've noticed over the years that we've known each other. I've seen you do graphic design for things. You made your own videos for a brief period of time, showing people how to make certain cured meat items. And, you built your own website. And clearly you're very talented with an iPhone because you take better food photos than any food writer.
It's the phone. Trust me, it's the phone.
No, it's not, because we all have an iPhone, Bruce Wieszala. And every food writer in town, and most of the ones I follow on Instagram or, Twitter or whatever, their pictures aren't nearly as lovely as yours. And I know you're turning 400 shades of red right now. But really, you have an incredible eye and understanding of light and composition. And your plates are really varied because you are very meat-focused in some respects, although you do love a vegetable, and you are really good with soup. But, your dishes really vary in terms of what the ingredients are and what kind of food you're serving, because you do have some very homey, comfy things as well as some very high-end things, and yet your plating is always modern and fresh and impeccable. So talk to me about that.
Well, I mean, definitely the what you're actually making has to reflect in the presentation of it. I mean, it just depends on the level of refinement that you're taking the food to, or how rustic it is. I mean, you're not gonna, make a rustic dish and make it all fancy and fruit like the dish that you're using the picture of.
Yes, which is, tell us about that dish first.
Well, that's it's basically a simmer dish. I believe I had to pull it up because it's
so it will be on if you're looking at SoundCloud or you've found the Grain of Salt podcast on Facebook, it will be the picture that's on your right. Will be the picture that we're talking about, and that's Bruce Wieszala's dish, which is a shrimp dish. It's
it does have it's a halibut, seared halibut, and I had some beautiful Hockerite turnips from native offerings and some snap peas and the thing about the dish is that what I like to do is, even in summertime, I like to make broths, but lighter broths.
Mm-hmm.
But I like to make them deceptively flavorful.
Right.
If that
makes depth
I
of
mean,
flavor.
it looks. I mean, if you look at the picture, it basically looks like colored water,
mm-hmm.
but it's actually a shrimp broth that I use shrimp tails and
that should be potent in flavor. Then
and even I incorporated dried shrimp from the Asian market and really steeped it a long time and added coriander and all kinds of spices to it. So it looks very simple just to look at the picture, but I like to surprise people with that depth of flavor. It's got some king trumpet mushrooms, in the head-on prawn. And one thing I notice about the dish, and this is one thing that goes back to shooting photographs and all that, which I kind of got from my dad. He was a photographer, and one thing he told me was that's important that makes things appealing is the rule of thirds.
Yes.
Or the golden ratio. So if you look at a lot of my plates, a lot of things are offset to kind of the side. And
so are your photographs.
That's just incorporating the rule of thirds, and it's just more appealing to the eye, and it just, as opposed to having everything symmetrical. And I hate even numbers. Everything has to be an odd number, preferably prime. But
prime number, love it.
But yeah, that's basically the whole concept of this dish. It's definitely a little more refined. Whereas, if I'm doing a pasta dish or something like that, I'm not going to really, take the time to, put that much effort into it.
You're not going to sculpt it as much.
Exactly.
Right.
I want to obviously make it look nice
edible,
and appealing,
beautiful.
and something somebody wants to really dig into. But I'm not going to, and also it has to be practical.
Right.
I'll
you have to be able to plate it when you're busy.
Exactly.
Right. You have to be able to have your sous chef plate it if you're not there.
It's all about the execution of it.
Right.
You can really come up with some elaborate platings, but if you can't execute it time after time efficiently, then what's the point of doing it? Even a dish like this, literally I use 2 pans to create the dish, even though there's so many elements on there. You have to think, is it economical in movement to plate it and get it out fast? Because I think, you see some of these chefs and they're using 3 pans for one dish. That's absurd.
Certainly if you're doing numbers, it's not even possible.
Exactly. I would never create a dish where you have to use 3 pans to plate it up. Most of this, I have a small pot where I actually poach the vegetables and the shrimp and the broth, so that imparts flavor not only into the vegetables, but you get more of that shrimp flavor into the broth itself. And in just one pan to sear the vegetables, and I think I've got the king trumpet mushrooms where I just sear those right in the pan with the fish. So
with the halibut.
Yeah, everything can be done in 2 pans and plated up, fairly quickly.
And yet it has still that idea of the components being individual, as opposed to home cooks who will just put everything in the pan at once and mush everything in sort of together.
Right, exactly.
Right. So it's more like using your pan almost as a griddle, where things maintain individual cooking levels instead of I'm just making sure home cooks sort of understand. And so in order to move forward in this conversation, I want to kind of go through some basic vocabulary definitions, and so that when we're communicating with the audience and with each other, we're all using the same terminology, because there really isn't a book about modern plating where there's been a universal decision about the words that that should be used. So I did the best that I could here. So in terms of talking about the way food used to be plated, certainly once a la carte cuisine came into fashion and food was served independent, it used to be, that all food was carried out on a giant tray, mounted with food and overly decorated and ornamental and kind of crazy over the top. And then, Escoffier introduced the idea, of serving things a la carte and people receiving a plate that has just their portion on it. And so the classic plating style is to have, if you look at a plate from above and you think of it as a clock, is to have the protein or the main component of the dish at 6 o'clock. And then to have, and I just don't want to get it wrong, so I'm going to look at my notes. And to have the starch between 10 and 11 and the vegetable placed at 1 and 2. And today we call that sort of country club plating or wedding food banquet plating.
I didn't even know that was an actual.
It's a real thing. But it's sort of outmoded, despite the fact that it's still used in a lot of places.
It sounds like the way my mom used to play things.
Exactly. Right. So it's a little outdone. And then in the 90s came, and the early aughts came, this idea of stacking food, which is still being used in a lot of Buffalo restaurants and probably lots of other mid-sized cities in the Midwest, or the shingled look, which is like to put a stack of mashed potatoes and then wedge your sort of steak or protein in sort of a angled way where some of it's sitting on the plate and some of it's leaning up against the potatoes or whatever, the gratin or whatever it is. But what we're talking about really, and what we're going to try to talk about a lot, is the modern forms of plating, which, so I'm just going to read some definitions, please bear with. Landscape plating is basically what it sounds like. It takes inspiration from landscape gardens, be they Zen or more sort of convoluted than that. This arrangement of components on the plate or in a bowl is laid out flat for the most part and is quote-unquote landscaped. Then we're going to talk about freeform plating, which involves placing food on the dish in an abstract manner that may seem careless and unintentional at first glance, but when done properly is actually purposeful and creates an improved experience for the diner, not just visually, but also the way in which the style requires the food to be eaten. And then the last form of modern plating, which we probably won't talk about a whole lot, has more to do with the plates and vessels used than the way the food is arranged. For example, organic plating, which uses slate, wood, and other things found in nature in place of china or other more traditional pieces of dinnerware. And then futuristic plating, where specific dishes or props are made from china, stainless steel, lucite, or other food-safe substances. For example, Grant Achatz of Chicago, every single dish is custom made for them. Or Daniel Hum of 11 Madison Park also has several dishes that have been made specifically for him. We don't see as much of that here because we just don't live in an environment that, makes
it's
sense
expensive.
for you to order custom dishes. But I think that what's really interesting is kind of the differentiation between landscape plating and freeform plating. And I think that both actually probably came from this idea that rather than providing people with, let's say, sauce, protein, starch, veg on the same plate in mounds that are separated, where people are kind of randomly eating either one or two or three or four of the components at a time, landscaped and freeform plating kind of encourage you to go in and make every bite a little bit different.
Yeah.
Because you're really experimenting. So it makes sense to have 14 things on a plate, maybe. Well, that's questionable. But, over 4 things on a plate because you're really offering people, here's a pop of pink peppercorn, here's a little bit of this, uzu gel or whatever,
Just
so
the different combinations of flavors and
exactly.
the possibilities.
It makes every
that,
bite different and sort of interesting. And I also think that some of those plating styles came from the idea that protein is becoming increasingly scarce. People are increasingly eating less large portions of protein, and that in other places in the world it makes sense to have twice or 3 times the veg, half the starch and half the protein. And so this new modern sort of, I was calling it strewn plating a couple of years ago when it didn't really have a term, but landscape plating or freeform plating really encourage people to consume more vegetable, less starch, less protein, and to have every bite be like a giant surprise. So what do you guys, can you talk with me? Jenny, what do you think about that?
I love the idea of it, both aesthetically and as far as your palate is concerned. It's like having 5 or 6 different dishes on your plate with not having to order, without having to order that many. It's beautiful to look at. You're allowed to play around with all different kinds of colors and things that you really wouldn't match together normally. It's almost like a great big appetizer plate that is a substantial first course, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
I'm going to reiterate your idea of, just a different little burst of flavor in every bite. I mean, it just keeps the diner interested, both visually because of the variation in shapes and colors, and the new and different flavors that they can get without having to order a bunch of different things.
And I think we're increasingly finding as the world becomes more and more global and more flavors are available to home cooks that they can access at home. And, it's just like this endless world of opportunity to taste and experience different flavors and textures. I think that's why small plates are becoming increasingly popular and shared plates, because not nobody. The modern diner doesn't necessarily want to sit down to a 30-ounce steak and eat nothing but steak and mashed potatoes. They want to have this varied experience. And so a landscaped entree really provides that, which would only be found in small plates maybe 10 years ago.
Right. What I like about it, though, is that it's going to stay on track. I find that sometimes if you go out to dinner with a large group of people and you're at a restaurant where they like to serve many large plates or offer many small plates, so Bruce is going to order something, say raw oysters, and Christa, you'll order something, and I'll order something, and they may not flow properly. Mm-hmm. So we'll each get a little bite. We'll spend $200. We're not going to feel so well afterwards because it's a mishmash sometimes.
Right.
It doesn't have the flow of a meal.
It doesn't have that sort of steady process that a chef
Right.
really, like with a pre-fee or a determined meal, sort of is designed.
That's exactly
A
right.
natural progression.
That's on purpose.
You got
We're
it.
not tasting sweet things before this because it'll kill our palate. We're not, all the rules of how to serve somebody a meal that's progressive, that flows.
Right.
Right.
So with something like this, you have a variety to keep yourself interested, but the chef has planned it out for you.
It all makes sense on one plate.
Right. Not as much of an uncomfortable mishmash as sometimes a large group of small plates that weren't necessarily meant to be eaten together will be.
Right. And what do you think, Bruce? How do you feel about this? I mean, you were really, I could be wrong, and I'll own that I might be wrong. But in my observation of our community, is my opinion that you were probably the first person to really use landscape style plating on the regular in a restaurant. And I think it started at Carmelo's and then carried on it to Brie.
Yeah. I mean, foodscaping, landscaping, or whatever. It's it just seemed like a natural way to present all the items on the plate, so you can actually see what it is you're eating. It's just not just a big pile of food all stacked up, and you can't identify, what this is or what that is because it's all hidden under, a huge piece of meat or whatever.
Right.
And I think, like you were saying, we're focusing more attention on vegetables as opposed, although the protein does play a very important part in certain dishes. It's also the abundance of vegetation that we have available to us now, and I think they in themselves lend to the actual presentation of the dish, simply because if people can see every component that's on your plate, you tend to want to take more care in the way you prepare that item, like vegetables and so forth, where you just don't want to boil the shit out of them and hammer them to the point where they're lifeless.
Which was the way
you want
vegetables
them to be,
were treated in this country for the last 95 years.
Right, and they're still being treated that way.
Well, in most places, yeah.
But you really want to highlight the vegetable for what it is. Just cook it the way that really brings out everything that vegetable can be. I mean, typically when I design a dish and it's got vegetables on it, like I rarely blanch anything ahead of time because I think really you're leaching a lot of the flavor, first of all, and nutrients out of a dish. So
I couldn't agree more. Remind me because I want to talk about that again when we wind this up a little bit.
A lot of times when I design a dish with certain vegetables, I mean they're pretty much raw up to the point where that dupe is fired and
then you just make them fork tender.
Right, exactly. Just put them in a pan, either saute them or just in a pan with just a little bit of salted water or stock or vegetable stock, and just so that instant when they're when they're perfect, they're going right onto the plate. Because a lot of times, like old school thought is, well, you blanch everything so it's ready to go and blah blah blah. And I think it really is the instant you blanch that vegetable, it's losing quality. Right. From the second you pull it out. So like if you look at my summer mise en place, typically is a bunch of ninth pans just filled with raw vegetables. Mm-hmm. And it's just all cooked a la minute, and it's very vibrant and very just very flavorful as soon as it hits the plate.
And if I could just make a sidetrack, you learned this appreciation for vegetables really from Linton Hopkins. Is that correct?
Yes.
Because I mean,
and Michael Toohey as well.
You're a Buffalo guy, And so, you have the same experience as every other 40-something Buffalo guy. And so for you to kind of have this very unique... When I met you, you had just moved back to Buffalo. I think it was like, what year was that? 2007?
2008?
Something like that?
Yeah.
And you already were showing this, deep passion and sort of almost worship of vegetables, which was really, I only saw a couple other chefs in town doing
Everybody knows
that
me
time.
as the meat guy or the pig guy.
I
or
know, which
whatever,
I think
but-
is so funny. And Steve, too. Steve is also, amazing with a salad or a soup and can make crazy good vegetable dishes. And it's so funny because both of you have this, meat reputation, but honestly, my favorite things to eat from both of you are your vegetable dishes.
He really knows. He really respects the stuff that we get from guys like Dan Oles
and Native Offerings, right?
Yeah.
And so, but you really came back to town to be a chef with this experience that you cultivated in Atlanta, where they have, of course, an abundance of produce available pretty much year round. And you guys, when you were shopping, when you were working for Linton, you guys would shop every day in the farmer's market.
Yeah. Well, actually, it was we would shop on weekends, but it was even more convenient because the farmers would come every other day. Just pull the truck up, and whatever you had to work with that day was reflected on the menu. I mean, the menus literally. Not entirely, but I mean, every day you would have to make changes to the menu based on what was available because we only used what, they would bring to us.
Do you remember the day the switch flipped for you where you looked at vegetables really differently than you had in your previous lifetime? Because you were an engineer before that, and then you worked a couple grunt jobs you decided to have a new career. So you worked a couple grunt jobs to learn how to be a cook. And then you very quickly worked your way from Emerald's Place up through the ranks of a long list of really top-notch Atlanta restaurants.
Yeah, I mean, I've always even when I was a kid, I loved Brussels sprouts because I think part of it comes from the way my mom would cook. I mean, she would once she stopped using canned mushrooms and stuff and started using fresh mushrooms and even stuff like Brussels sprouts where most kids hate.
Yeah.
I always loved them because she didn't boil the heck out of them. She would just chop them up and throw them in a pan and
saute them.
And saute them. So I've always really had an appreciation for vegetables and not just meat. So.
And Linton just urged and pushed that.
Yeah, and then I realized, wow, you can actually meet the guy who grew this stuff.
Right.
I mean, that was really a turning point because you don't want to let those people down. They put all that work into it. So.
And Jenny, similar situation because when I first met you, which was probably around the same time I first met Brucey.
Yeah, probably.
You guys have a greenhouse at the mansion, and there's a lot of effort to kind of cultivate very seasonal food, very vegetable-based food. And in fact, at James Beard House, you were, we cooked a dinner at the James Beard House a year and a half ago, the Nickel City chefs did, and Jenny was like, can I please have the salad? Nobody else wants the salad. And you made this gorgeous salad with all these different carrots prepared in a myriad ways and plated what looked to be effortless, but I watched you plate them, so I know it wasn't effortless, 100 plates of salad. So
Thank you.
Your sort of love for vegetables, I think, also has impact on the way you plate things because you don't want to just have baby carrots in a corner or steamed broccoli, as a side dish. You've incorporated vegetables in a very beautiful way into a lot of the food that you prepare. So can you chat with me a little bit about that? I didn't mean for us to have a conversation about vegetables, but I'm really excited about it.
Oh, thank you, by the way. That was very nice of you. And I think that
the most polite chef in town, Jenny Boye, ladies and gentlemen.
I think Bruce really hit the nail on the head. You see the amount of work that these farmers go through to produce these things for you. I mean, why do you want to destroy them? Why do you want to kill them? So from beginning to end, from the time you receive them until the time it's plated, you want to treat them properly. Unfortunately, we don't have a greenhouse at the mansion. We have a beautiful garden.
That's right.
But we had
I'm
a gardener.
sorry.
No, please. No. I just want to give credit where credit
Of
is
course.
due. Our gardener, we had a greenhouse at her house.
That's right. And that's where the fig tree was.
The fig tree was in our garden.
Okay, see, I'm so confused.
I know, it's confusing.
I'm sorry.
It's all right. No, please don't. She grew, our gardener, her name was Betsy Manchetti. She's no longer with us but at the mansion. But she grew all those baby carrot greens and things like that.
All the beautiful things.
Yeah, now I know the amount of work that she went through to do that. So for me to drench them in dressing or not refrigerate them properly or anything like that would be a travesty. So,
and you're using more farms now at the mansion too.
Yeah.
Correct? You have a relationship with the Olds Promised Land CSA.
Yep, absolutely.
And so you're sourcing their stuff from them all season long.
Yeah, all season long, which was difficult. It's difficult when you don't work in an a la carte restaurant.
Yes.
To be able to do that. And I was really struggling with that morally. Whenever I would take one of your farm trips, I would feel almost guilty. Why aren't I buying pork from Rich Tillieu at Tea Meadow? I'm not doing things the right way.
But when you have to be able to make dinner for 250 people right now, where are you going to get 250 local pork chops?
That's exactly
I mean, that's a challenge a lot of places, clubs and places like the Mansion and larger restaurants struggle with in terms of sourcing local.
I mean,
absolutely.
Even like at our place, I mean, we have, certain pork items on the menu that are our mainstay, where obviously you can't, get that steady supply of pork bellies or the blade chops, but, you try to source, on a mass amount as responsibly as you can. You try and get natural stuff like, using the Corbuto pork and stuff that's not treated with antibiotics and stuff like that. So there is a balance you have to keep. Obviously, whenever we get in one of Rich's pigs, I mean, that's, amazing. You get to do so many cool things with it. But, there's only so much you can get out of a pig, and you can't just, ask Rich for bellies every week. Like, I go through 2 a week.
Right.
Easily. So, I mean, there's really not that supply without getting, everything attached to it where, definitely we could use it, but I mean, there's things that we really need a steady supply of. So you try to be as responsible as you can, but also, you have to have that balance if you're going to have something on your menu all the time.
So I want to go back to talking about plating, but I did mention that we were going to sidetrack a little bit when you talked about how every second that a vegetable is cooked, that it loses nutrients and flavor. And so I have this idea I've been playing around with, and it's not an original idea. It's kind of just a hybrid mishmash of an idea. And I want to share it with you guys. First of all, I think that plating certainly impacts how flavorful a dish is, and that can be based on the proportions of what is on that plate, like a landscaped plate. And we'll talk about this more in a minute. That it needs to have still the right proportion of sauce to accoutrement, to protein, to vegetable, to starch, because just throwing things on a plate that look like they might have come out of Noma doesn't actually make them work. I say that very facetiously. But I think that it can lead things to have different flavors and a different psychological impact on the person who's eating them, the way that something is plated. But I think... So here's the hybrid idea. The hybrid idea kind of pulls from the raw movement and the biodynamic wine movement, which is that food that is still alive, your body receives it in a very different way than food that is dead. And so the fresher a vegetable is and the less cooked it is, not only the healthier it is, but the more you actually can have sort of a connection to that food. I know it's very voodoo-y, but like the biodynamic wine movement has this idea right now that not only they already do certain things in farming based on the moon cycles, but that they also actually there's a contingent of biodynamic wine people who believe that wine that is biodynamic and naturally made should only be consumed on certain days based on the moon cycle, and that it cannot taste as good based on where the moon is. And so I'm thinking that combined with Bruce is looking at me like I'm crazy. That with the idea of raw food, this food is alive and we are alive, and our consumption of it is more than just feeding ourselves the way you feed a gas tank. And so I wonder if plating and eating things in smaller portions and changing the way that dish tastes, and the fresher that food is, the more vibrant it is in color, all of those things actually impact not only the healthiness of the food, but your enjoyment of it and your appreciation, your connection to that food. Well, this a little voodoo-y. I get it. But
well, if you're eating something that looks vibrant and very appealing, obviously, psychologically, it's going to taste better, but it actually does taste better.
Right.
I mean, you know,
because it's retained its flavor, it's retained its nutrients. And I think there's maybe a molecular connection there that is not something we can immediately identify that actually makes that a more pleasant experience on all levels. And that's what I think this landscape plating thing has kind of really transformed the way we perceive food and what our expectations when we sit down at a meal. And I feel for anyone who is listening to this podcast and hasn't had enough varied sort of experiences with this modern plating idea to really understand and appreciate that, because I think it's something you have to experience to not, dismiss as being silly.
Right.
Particularly if you're somebody who wants, a fish fry that hangs off the side of the plate or whatever. But I do think that it really, it's a whole you're right, Bruce. It's a psychological thing. And I think it's also a physical thing as well.
I think it is.
yeah,
I think
absolutely.
it's the kind of thing where you have to take a step backward to move forward. I mean, think about us as human beings before we had accessibility to modern conveniences like heat sources and being able to throw something on your gas stove. Out of necessity, we ate raw.
Right.
And you foraged. And I think that's in some...
and you ate seasonally and fresh.
Right. And I think that's kind of why plates that look like they were created at Noma are appealing to our core a little bit because they're unusual. It looks like, they did go and forage and just pick around.
Reindeer moss.
Right, yeah. And there's ants on there, and they might be alive and they might not. But I think it subconsciously speaks to our core. Or not to sound voodoo-y again.
No, but it's almost like a prehistoric sort of hearkening, right?
Right, yeah.
I don't know. I just think that's a fascinating thing. And I get that some people are going to think I'm a freak because I was talking about moon phases or whatever. And I'm okay with that because most of you who already know me know I'm a freak. So it won't be new revelation. But I really do think that there is something to be said about understanding that connection. I mean, we know for a fact, for example, and I'm going to get the percentage wrong here because I haven't given this lecture in probably 2 years, but like when you pick broccoli, it takes 3 days for it to lose, for example, I think it's 53% of its vitamin C. That's probably a wrong number, but it's the best I can remember right now. So when we're getting broccoli at the supermarket, it's, 3 weeks old, maybe more. And they're even sometimes cutting certain vegetables unripe. And not ripened in the sun. Yeah. And so they're missing...
It's loaded on a truck, and it's ripening on the way during that 3,000-mile journey.
Or gassed,
whatever.
like tomatoes, bananas. Yeah. So, the problem is that the nutrition that was in a World War II carrot is not the nutrition that's in a 2015 carrot.
That you would buy at the supermarket.
Right. That you, of course, we're not talking about local food. And so, I think that has a lot to attribute with why we aren't satisfied, why we crave salt, why we crave fat, why we crave sugar, is that we're not getting all of the nutrients that we need from our food. And even people who are following prescribed diets are sometimes not getting all the nutrients they need from their food. I mean, the vitamin business is bigger than it's ever been. Yeah. And I think that the idea of making food appealing and appreciating every ingredient and cooking it as, I'm not a raw food advocate, but cooking vegetables and proteins as minimally as possible. Right. I just think that these things really do impact us.
And another thing is, I mean, people talk about snout to tail and, using the whole animal, but what about using the entire vegetable?
Well, I mean,
like root to leaf.
Yeah, I mean,
a lot of times I'll buy a bunch of beets or a bunch of turnips or a bunch of carrots, and I don't even snip the greens off. I'll keep them whole.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree. I think that 5 years ago it was
plate.
Crazy to think about eating the greens on carrots or the leaves on celery. We were just throwing all that away, and we all know that the celery leaves are the most flavorful part of celery.
Right.
So to be tossing that stuff aside, I mean, we just clueless animals here in terms of how we're
and there's so
ourselves.
Much flavor in those parts of the vegetable. I mean, why just discard it, use it.
And so we talked a little bit about the idea of people attempting to sort of mimic this style of landscaped or freeform plating. And I think really the purpose of the difference between the two is, in my opinion, freeform plating can have height in places, can have some level of stacking or difference in levels where landscape is really predominantly flat. Right. So, in both of those types, we see a lot of younger chefs trying to mimic that plating style, and I think that's a good thing. They should be. because it's probably the way most food in fine dining restaurants, at least, is going to be for the next handful of years. But there's still not this understanding of balance and making sure proportions are right and making sure there's a good variety of flavors and textures on the plate, but not too many. And so I guess, Jenny, what would be sort of, Bruce is jumping in.
I think another thing that's important is, you can make a dish look amazing, but one thing I never do is sacrifice the flavor of a dish or the integrity of a dish.
Or the profile, overall profile.
Yeah,
right?
just strictly because I want it to look a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
You never want to sacrifice flavor for over presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Presentation is always important, but first and foremost, it really has to taste good.
Well, and I, having been now both victim and victor in terms of having eaten lots of food that's been plated this way over the course of the last 5 years, I have found that there are lots of times you can tell that a chef has tasted a bite of this dish, but has never sat down and tried to eat this whole dish because there's not enough sauce, or there's too much protein, or there's not enough vegetable, or it's missing not just seasoning, which can happen accidentally in expo or during the process of cooking, but literally that the proportions don't work, that it's too dry, or there's too much of something. I understand that not every cook in the kitchen can eat every dish, but shouldn't every chef eat every dish they serve in its entirety before it's
totally guilty of
doing? You don't eat ever, Bruce. You haven't even eaten today.
Of course,
it's
I
9
do.
o'clock at night.
No, I do. But the thing is, like when I compose a dish, I can almost picture the way it tastes in my head, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I will taste every
years of experience to call on.
I will taste every individual component of a dish, but it's a rarity where I actually and it's the same for most chefs where they sit down and eat an entire composed dish that they've created. That rarely.
Okay,
rarely
I'm going to
happens.
say that needs to start happening.
unless you're in a place like Le Bernardin where they toil over a dish for months and months, and then they all get all their sous chefs together and they plate it up and they taste everything together. That rarely happens.
It's not a reality in a regular everyday fine dining restaurant.
Right. Like I said, I definitely taste the components of the dish, but it's a rarity where I actually taste the dish in its entirety, and it tends to work out.
Is that how you stay as svelte as you are, Bruce?
I'm on a high carb diet. Trust me. That's Dagler. I have to have my toasted bun and gravy, mid service every day. Lots of carbs.
Jenny, what about you? What do you think about this whole notion of, things not always working together, or a chef needing to eat or consume a plate in its entirety to understand if there's enough of each component in balance? What do you think about that? Am I crazy to suggest this idea?
Oh, no, not at all. I think that every chef knows they should do it. But like Bruce said, there's time constraints.
I definitely know I should do it.
Yeah, no.
See, I thought you were fighting me and I was going to have to take you out.
No, I know I should do it.
No, we know. It's one of those things where we should be doing this. But, you do fall back on your experience a little bit. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you've got 200 people walking in the door, you don't have time to take, 10 to 15 minutes to eat and contemplate something.
Unless it's over a garbage can mid-service.
Unless it's over a garbage can you're shoving it in your face, yeah.
Yeah.
There are so many other things that are tricky about that style of plating, though, that I kind of want people to realize that I especially want young chefs who might not have a lot of experience doing it.
That's why we're having this conversation.
And I don't do this a lot at work because I'm not a la carte. I do things a little bit differently. I cook for weddings, Dan and I do. So I can't always take the time and do those intricate things as much as we would like to. But one of the reasons why it's difficult, aside from what you were saying about making sure that everything is perfectly balanced, is that you don't have anything to hide under. When we're talking country club plating or that classic
plating,
right?
Yeah.
You've got a pile of mashed potatoes, and maybe you did overcook your vegetables a little bit, so you'll sneak them in underneath. Or you know what? Everything got a little cold, so I'll put a sauce over it. You can't do that with this kind of plating.
Right.
All your food is spread out, so everything's going to get chilled a little bit faster.
And the portions of each bite is smaller because things are typically bite-sized.
Absolutely. Right? Your sauces are sometimes in tiny little dots, and if they're not perfectly the perfect consistency, they're going to slide all over.
Right.
So all that time that you took to make that gorgeous plate
now it's gonna be
is
cold.
now cold, weepy, and kind of funny looking if you don't have all your ducks in a row.
Right.
I think that so many people who are newer to this business take a look at a cookbook and say, I can make this. I just have to take it apart in my mind and then put it back together. And it isn't always the case. Like Bruce was saying before, if it doesn't taste good and if it isn't made properly,
independent of the other ingredients.
exactly, then it doesn't really matter what it looks like.
And the execution of the dish during a busy service.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, you're going to have the time to make 14 of those.
Right.
You know?
Right. So I'm going to just note that in order to continue this conversation sort of moving forward, or to give everybody an idea, I think what I'm going to do is actually take like 10 pictures of each of your food that I'm going to pick, neener, and put them up on Grain of Salt Facebook page so that people can look at them sort of in a more detailed fashion.
I don't know if I have 10.
I have 10 of pictures of your food.
Can we get approval first, please?
Yeah, of course.
All right.
Please. Give me a break.
In your last competition, everything looked amazing.
Incredible.
Oh, thanks, Bruce.
Incredible.
We appreciate that very much. Thank
Really
you.
beautiful food.
Thank
That's
you.
what I was
Nailed it.
thinking of. I was thinking of the
you.
rutabaga, celery root, gingerbread, little lady. I don't know what's the term?
Napoleon?
Napoleon.
I guess you'd call it.
Yeah, just a little bit, please, Bruce. We're having a nice Alsatian wine right now. That's good. Thank you. So, I think that it would be a good idea for people to be able to get some better pictures rather than just the two we were talking about, which we'll use.
Yeah.
So before we wind this up, I'd like to hear from both of you sort of what you would like to see more of in terms of how things are being plated locally, what you'd like to see people get away from, or maybe even some predictions for plating styles that you think we may see more of in the future. Any thoughts, ladies and gentlemen?
Bruce, you first.
He's looking at you like, please go first, Jen.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I just there are so many things you take into consideration when you like construct the way you think a plate should look. Like seasonality, obviously. What are the components of the dish, and how do you want people to actually eat it? Without actually having to tell them. Like,
how to eat it. You can't.
Right, like these pretentious
any dish
restaurants,
that comes with
the
instructions
chefs
can go fuck
exactly,
itself.
Exactly. You just want to lay it out in a way that makes sense, that people almost have no choice but to eat it.
Right. Don't
that
interrupt
way.
me while I'm on a hot date to tell me how to eat my dinner.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like, that's fucked up. Okay.
But yeah, and also like I said, just always think of flavor first, and the way the dish is going to taste, and don't compromise the ingredients just because you want it to look a specific way on the plate. Really it is secondary. Just make it look appealing to people, and make it look like no matter what it is. I still do, like you said, where you lay the protein on, like, the mashed potatoes or whatever.
A leaning.
A leaning
I think
thing.
it's called shingled, actually.
Yeah, shingled, whatever you want to call it, because that's I think the way the dish should be presented. It's just the type of, like, for example, we have a pork chop dish, and it just comes with some, mashed squash that's spiced, and a little puree and sauce and vegetables, and that's. How much are you going to want to dress that up?
Right.
Really?
And
without
I
looking
don't really
like,
want you to cut my
without
pork
looking
chop
like an
into
asshole.
19
You know what I
bite-sized
mean?
pieces either.
Exactly. You
Like,
just
that doesn't
wanna,
really lend itself to that, because I don't
Right.
need all 8 whatever cooked of each bite of pork chop. You know what I mean?
Just think about what the dish is and what you're trying to convey, and the amount of refinement that's in the dish, and
Don't force it.
don't force it. Just make the dish what it is,
Yeah.
And don't fuck up the vegetables.
and don't fuck up the vegetables.
And Jenny?
I don't like it. I touched on this a little bit when we were talking about landscape plating. Copying directly from a cookbook, it drives me crazy. And we don't see it a lot, but I know people do it.
I don't know. I
Yeah,
can
you
see
see it a lot.
dishes all over in fine restaurants in Buffalo that have been
like verbatim.
directly right. And you know what? Fine. Like Tony Riles at the hotel makes a handful of cocktails from top-notch cocktail pouring ribbons and really great cocktail places, and he credits them. So
Of
you know what?
course.
Fine. Put that dish from 11 Madison Park. Credit them.
Absolutely.
You know, I just think it's unfortunate when people are like, oh my God, this dish is amazing. And it's like, yeah, I read that in,
Right.
Sephora last week. you know?
Yeah, and I'm not saying that you're not supposed to get inspiration
You
from
should
these.
get
Oh my God,
inspiration.
inspiration.
And
That's my point.
Art is about borrowing.
Exactly. Inspiration, tiny little bits and pieces. I think that if you start off with skill, and if you've been in this business for a long time and you own a successful restaurant or you've held down a job for any period of time, you've got some skill. You know how to cut properly. You know how to cook properly. The beautiful plating will follow.
Mm-hmm.
Don't force it. Like
The
Bruce
beautiful
was
plating
saying.
shouldn't come first.
Right,
Overcooking
right.
and cutting properly.
Right. Even if you were going to do the protein at 6 o'clock and your vegetables at 2 and your potato at 11, if you've got perfect cuts and perfect consistencies and bright and vibrant colors because you didn't turn everything to gray mush, your plate is going to look beautiful.
Which you make a good point. I mean, it all comes back to like skill. You don't want to, have let's say a piece of diced eggplant where you've got a boulder,
Right.
and then a little 1/8-inch square of you really want to
Portion.
good portions
Practice
and
that
everything
brunoise.
in proportion to So I mean, skill definitely plays a role in it. I think my aha moment was when I opened up the Michel Bras cookbook.
Yeah.
That
I didn't mean that. I actually didn't mean that. Sorry, that just kind of came out.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah, talk about a god
well,
of
I mean,
plating.
yeah. If you look at his stuff, it's just amazing. But practically nobody has the time to do what he does
Right.
consistently,
Well,
day after day.
and some of it, I mean, honestly, like the bacon on a swing or a sling. I mean, I was at this really high-end restaurant in Montreal, paid $8 zillion for dinner, 19 billion courses later, and like the second course was like literally bacon on a clothesline with little tiny clothespins.
You don't. That's
I wanted to pick it up and walk in the kitchen and shove it down the throat of the chef.
that's
I was
another
like,
thing you run a
this
risk
is
of with these young
ridiculous.
kids is
This isn't even whimsical. This is just
Getting
plain
too gimmicky.
fucking stupid.
you don't want it. You really don't want it to be gimmicky. I mean, it can get to a point where
Whimsy and gimmick are two different things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's
You want it to like invoke a certain emotion
think it's-
without it being silly.
You're dishonoring the food when you treat it like it's a toy.
That's exactly it. And don't you get a little put out when, or how do I put it? I get a little like, I don't want to eat this when it looks like it's been too manipulated by hands.
Well, that's as Julia Child said, right? When you see a beautiful plate, 8,000 people have had
Right.
their hands in
Touched
it.
it. Right.
And it's like so true.
Yeah.
Although with tweezers today, we see a little bit less of that.
Right.
But you're right. If something's been really manipulated and you can tell
Manhandled.
900 people have massaged the hell out of it before
Right.
it got
It's-
into your mouth, it's a little ooky.
It is. Yeah, it's molded. And,
Yeah.
you can see fingerprints.
Yeah,
and,
no,
and that
somebody
kind of
like
thing.
served me a ball of something. I don't know what it was. It was a paste of something, and there's big greasy chefy
Yeah.
thumbprints in the bowl. I was like, I know where this guy's hands have been. I don't want to eat this.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I think, don't force it. That's kind of the key.
That's really cool. Well, do you guys have any, before we go, do you have any quick resources that you think that people who are interested in learning more about modern plating, maybe transforming some of those sort of suburban mid-casual restaurants into places that have some slightly more modern plating, where would somebody go to find that information?
I think just go to the bookstore.
Yes,
spend
I agree.
2 or 3 hours scouring, just walking through, taking a look at covers that you find interesting, taking a look at chefs that have a fantastic reputation, but also being realistic too, realizing that you're going to open up this gorgeous cookbook that costs $80, but they have a kitchen brigade of 30 cooks.
It's true, but even if you
And
look at
you've
like...
got 2
and
or
also
3, for
stick
example.
within the style of food that you're
Well, that's what
you're
I'm
doing.
Yeah.
I was just going to say,
You know
like,
what I mean?
Yoto Motalenge is not doing that kind of food, but his plating is still modern. Everything's served on big platters, and it's much more homey. It's much more casual, but it still has this feel of modernity.
It really does. It's dramatic looking and pleasing to the eye.
Yeah.
And doable. That's the key. It's doable.
At home, you can make that plate like that and serve your family.
Yeah.
So I think that there are some chefs out there who have written great cookbooks that are modern but are not necessarily doing this very finessed, very fine.
Even rustic looks beautiful.
Yeah, I agree.
If it's done
a lot of Italian food and
properly.
Indian food really shouldn't be served anyway but rustic, in my opinion.
right.
Unless you're Giorgio Locatelli, of course.
Well, of course. There are exceptions to the rule. Anyway, well, really, you guys, thank you so much for putting up with me and all of my voodoo talk and whatever. But couldn't be more pleased to have you here having this conversation. And I'm hoping that it's a conversation that 2 years from now would make sense to have again. Because I think, like I said, with the way things are moving so quickly and the more easily we are able to see changes in plating, like I'm hoping to see more exciting and more interesting things.
I think we kind of got slightly off track, but I think we really didn't, because everything that we talked about really is important to, I think, what we do for the plating.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? I mean, the food should speak for itself.
Right.
You know, so...
Well, I feel a little bit better about that.
It's not so much like, where you place it's, does the food look good? And don't hide it and let it be whatever it is.
And if you don't know what look good means, maybe you should do a little more reading. Do a little more cookbook scanning, a little more...
Go out to dinner.
Web, and go to dinner.
Yeah.
It's the one thing most cooks don't do.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah, you don't have the time.
Or the money.
You don't have the money.
But, you have to make it a priority to do. You really have to do that.
Right. Even if you go and you spend money and you didn't like a lot of the things that you ate, at least you can learn that maybe that isn't your style.
Yeah.
So
or that's not the way to do things.
Or
no,
it's not the way to do things.
No, I mean,
that's right.
Can you imagine a fashion designer who didn't ever look at anyone else's fashion?
Right.
It doesn't even make sense.
Yeah.
So.
There's a huge difference between being a copycat and getting inspiration.
I agree.
And there's nothing wrong with gaining inspiration from somebody that you respect.
I agree. And there are more places for inspiration than just other people's food. Go to the museum.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go to the opera. Watch a movie.
Yeah.
There's
Go
a million
to the park.
things.
Just look at nature.
Nature is a good one. There's architecture is a huge one. There's a million ways to be inspired.
Absolutely.
Actually, every day, all the time.
I'm trying to think how to incorporate Frank Lloyd Wright into my plating somehow.
Let's see if you can do that without any toothpicks. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, all right. Well, thank you so much, you guys. And thank you for listening to Grain of Salt. Again, you'll find pictures of Jennifer Boye from the mansion on Delaware Avenue's plating, as well as Bruce Wieszala, one of the chefs at Bourbon and Butter, on Grain of Salt's Facebook page. Thanks for listening.